Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the fourth part of the lecture on qualitative data collection. And in this video, we are going to look at interview as the most or one of the most popular research methods under the qualitative methodology. Okay. As we discussed in the previous part of the lecture, we know that qualitative methodology or qualitative research is emphasizing on analyzing the text and is interested in looking at multiple understandings, interested in individual subjective understanding, and is interested in different attitudes, views, and experiences. Okay, I think for that you should already known. We have different types of interviews. Well, to be specific, research interviews. We're not talking about interviews in other fields, but in the research domain. There are two popular ways that we could categorize interview format. One is to look at the number of participants. So the first one is one-to-one interviews. And this is quite common and commonly used by our students every year, where they perform as an interviewer and they interview whoever they want to as their research participant. That's a one-to-one interview, one-to-one format of interview. And we also have one-to-many, and we usually call them group interviews or focus group. This is when we have one or several researchers as an interviewer. Usually one would perform as the interviewer. Even when we have multiple researchers, the other researchers could perform other roles there, like a coordinator or note taker, for example. And we have multiple interviewees in the room where they would form the discussion, but facilitated by the interviewer. And no matter it is one-to-one or one-to-many in format, they can always choose one of the following formats. That's another way to categorize the format of interviews, which are unstructured, structured, or semi-structured. We will talk each of these in the next few slides. The first type I want to talk about is the unstructured or non-structured interviews. So this is the most informal format of research interviews. When we think about interviews, this could be the one which first pop up into our mind and compare with when we're doing a quantitative type of research. So informal, unstructured interviews refers to the type of interview where it's more like a talk. It's very free, and we try our best to put in our conversation in a natural setting. And for example, if you want to know somebody's work experience, you may try your best to put your interviewees in the scenario of their real or everyday work environment and try to let them recall their memory of what they've done or what they would have done in certain scenarios that you've given them. And in this setting, in a natural setting, interviewees have much more freedom on what they can say, and they can bring up very, very rich data. They can give you maybe sometimes too much data on what you want to find out. But the advantage of having such format, the unstructured format of interview, is that you could get very rich data because you're setting very limited boundaries on what your interviewees can say. Okay, but it can also create problems for you. For example, they could go a little bit too wild, and they could go off track on what you like, far from what you originally want to find out, or they could use too much time and talking on one question, but not like not in that you, so that you don't have enough time and to cover other perspectives that you want to. Okay, but this is still a very good format if the nature of your research question is to explore a new area, especially if it's very, very new and you don't have much guidance from previous literature. And this could be very good to crack on something new. All right, the second type of format called structured interviews. This is the opposite to the unstructured, where you have already set up a list of questions, a very standardized list of questions before you start to, have any conversation with your interviewees. So this very formalized structure is called structured interviews. It is more like a questionnaire than an interview, and because for questionnaire it is the same. You have listed out all the questions that you want to ask. The difference between a questionnaire and a structured interview is that for questionnaire you can just leave the questions to your participants, and you don't need to be there, isn't it? So they can just fill the questionnaire and send it back to you or return it to you, either face-to-face or online. Whereas for interviews, even when it's structured interviews, you still need to be involved. So it's usually a, like, you can ask them a question, you can ask your interviewee a question, they would reply to you, and you ask them another question. So it's still a conversation style rather than, a questionnaire, which is kind of more or less purely rely on your interviewees. It's a one-side format. And for interviews, it's always a conversation style. Although the structured interview is much more restricted on what you will talk in that conversation and what questions you're going to ask in that conversation. So in this format of the interview, your interviewees would have very limited opportunity to expand on the questions, and because you already have a very, very standardized list of questions. So they should go through each of them, and we don't usually escape questions, or we don't usually change much of the questions, even though each respondent or each interviewees may have their own context or may have their own preference, etc. So this format can also be used in your research project. Again, it depends on the nature of your research question. So if your research question is to look at trying to find some general patterns, well, this format is better than the other format, because by having very structured questions, your answers would be more or less structured as well. So when they are structured, it's easier for you to compare. It's easier for you to generate a pattern, compare with too freely shaped answers. Okay. But as you can tell, the first and the second two types have their quite obvious advantages and disadvantages, whereas the third format is somewhere in the middle ground. It is in the middle ground, this semi-structured interviews. First thing is because of its format itself, it is not as free as unstructured, and is not as strict as a structured type of interview. So it's less standardized, but still has certain standard. It's in the middle. So we do have a certain guideline, okay, so when we are conducting our interviews, but we don't have to totally follow our guideline. We do have certain freedoms to make any changes based on the real situation from your interviewees. Okay, so this one is the most popular ones among students when they are doing their dissertations. This one is the most popular one, the semi-structured format. Whereas you would have a topic guide or an interview guide, which I have included an example in the next slide. So this is an example of a interview guide or topic guide, where you can see there this researcher has already listed a couple of questions, but differently from the structured interview, where you have to follow the this guide very strictly. In the semi-structured interview, you do have the freedom of changing orders, or like omitting some of the questions or adding more questions as you go along with the interviewees in your conversation. Okay, so here is an example of an interview guide in a semi-structured interview. So you are giving some space for your interviewees to be a little bit free on what they can say and what they want to express in your interviews. Okay, so here, as we mentioned earlier, that the interviewees would have certain freedoms. Well, how about interviewers? So the interviewers can partly involved in the data generalization or emerging process, whereas in the structured type of interview, and the interviewer almost play no rule or very, very neutral rule, because the interviewer is more like a question machine where the interviewer just throw out questions and followed by the orders in your standardized form. So you just ask the interviewees one by one, following your list of questions. That's the structured interviews. So in this way, the interviewer has very, very limited role in emerging the data. And also in this way, the data that you generalize are very, very standardized and structured, isn't it? And in the other extreme, in the unstructured interview, where you probably only have one question to start with, and then the rest of the question could be just depending on what your interviewee would say, and you would build it up in that format. And you as a interviewer or as a researcher actually would involve a lot in shaping how the interview would go. And in that way, the interviewer would play a quite important role in the data emerging process. And in the middle ground, in a semi-structured interview, the role of the interviewer is also somewhere in the middle between these two other structures, where the interviewer has some involvement in the data emerging process, because you may redirect the direction of your conversation, or you may change the direction, or you could shape the way how you want to shape your interviews. So the role of the interviewer is something you can think about when you are thinking of which format you want to choose for your research project. Okay. So here, again, this is to tell you that to be able to selecting which format is the most suitable format for your research project is a dilemma, is a trade-off between among the three types, isn't it? Whether you want to go for a more structured dimension, or whether you want to go for a more unstructured dimension, because either of them or all of them have their own advantages and disadvantages. And if you want to go for more structured, then you could have a higher reliability. A higher reliability. You still remember that we have the external reliability and the internal reliability from the part when we talk about rigor. Okay, so if you're going for a more structured route, then it is more possible that you can have your research design would have a high external and internal reliability. But in terms of validity and structure, it's hard to tell whether structured or unstructured or less structured would lead to which, whether it's a high or low validity. That would depend on the details of what question within your research question, interview question, how would you design your interview questions. And if you go for a less structured format, then you would get richer data, which is very good, but it could lead you to a position where you find it really, really hard to summarize the data among your interviewees, because it's hard to summarize when there's not much in common among them, isn't it? Okay, so these are the things that you should think about when you are deciding which type that you want to go for. Okay, again, this is again trying to make you aware that the advantages and disadvantages of each side, whether you want to go for more structured or less structured. So more structured is more towards to the quantitative dimension, and less structured would be towards to the qualitative dimension. So when you are thinking about which dimension you want to go for, I just want to address that. I think in our first part of this lecture, I have briefly mentioned about a concept that interviews are not all qualitative interviews. It is not all interviews are qualitative interviews. We could have quantitative kind of type of interview, especially when you are doing a structured type of interview. So here again, so when you are choosing which format of interview that you want to do, thinking about which dimension you want to go for, how you're going to analyze your data. So this is not only about your data collection, but also about your data analysis as well. So when you have your data with you, so you have the conversation and style and text with you, how you're going to analyze the data, whether you want to focus on, and trying to get some frequency data, which are the keywords, and the keywords has been mentioned by like 80% of the interviewees, or you try to count frequencies of a certain theme. So those are more like a quantitative thinking mind, where you try to generate a lot of patterns from your data. Whereas for more qualitative mindset would be you are more interested in certain factors or certain reasons behind the factor. So you want to look at the actual, the in-depth understanding or interpretation from the interviewees, even if only one or two of your interviewees has mentioned something, but you are very, very interested, rather than you try to look at a general pattern throughout your interviewees. So that's kind of two types of mindset here, and thinking about what type of mindset you are, and that may help you to identify what kind of interviews you would more prefer. But when you are justifying why a particular type of interviews would be suitable for your dissertation, and these are the kind of methodological reason behind. So it's not only the practicalities that we need to think about at a master's level, and you are encouraged to have more interactions with or engagement with the theoretical debate behind those practical stuff. Okay. And from now on, I am going to talk about some practical stuff, which is some tips on what to think about when you want to conduct your qualitative data collection. Okay, so the first question I want to talk about is designing or formulating your interview questions, assuming you're having a qualitative interviews. Okay, I'm sure you can, when you read through these bullet points, you can understand them. But why I'm still putting these bullet points here is, I know they look very, very simple and straightforward. For example, the first one, try not to use the yes or no questions. It looks so simple and everyone understands it, but every year I have dissertation supervisees who still design their interview questions in such format. Like, do you think you would do this, or do you think you would do that? This type of interview questions in their dissertation. And I think it's still worth bringing it up, and to remind you, just to remind you that when you are designing your interview questions, don't forget about these. Yeah, don't use, or try not to use, minimize the amount of questions where your interviewees can give a simple yes or no answer. Or if you think it's unavoidable, you have to use such questions, remember to always add a why question after that. So if you can ask your interviewees, would you do this or would you do that in your office? And after they say yes or no, always ask why. Why would you do this or why would you do that? That would be much better. So you can get a more qualitative type of data. So the yes or no type of data is more quantitative, because you can easily put them into numbers like 0 and 1, like 0 represent for no and 1 for represent for yes. So to try to avoid getting quantitative type of data in your qualitative data collection process. Okay, another tip when you are designing your interview questions is to form lettering. Lettering here refers to a process, a gradual process to build up your interview questions. So in your interviews, we don't usually start with a very difficult question and in your conversation, isn't it? Like when you meet up a friend or when you meet up a stranger on the road, when you talk to them, we don't start with a very difficult question. We start with like, how you're doing, are you all right? You know, we start with, we can call it ice-breaking questions, or in the interviews, we usually call the first couple of questions background questions or scene setting questions. So scene setting questions would allow us to get some basic information of your interviewees. Although those questions are not that difficult and not that directly related to your research question, but they usually do have certain connection, but don't seem like so. I can give you some examples. So in the first couple of questions in the interview, we tend to ask easy ones, like if you're interviewing an employee in a company, you could ask them, what is your job? How long have you been working in this company? Or, you know, what your job involves? And, you know, things which are quite easy for them to answer, that they don't have to think a lot to answer your questions. They should be very straightforward questions. And then in the second part of the interview, you gradually build up the level of discussions or the level of, you know, in depth, you know, you try to get more in depth questions as you go along in the conversation with your interviewee. So you, in the second or third part of your interview, you could ask those questions you are actually concerned about, the research related to your research questions. Okay, and here is a checklist for you. When you are thinking about using interviews in your research project, you could think about through this whole list whether you want to do a face-to-face interview or you want to conduct your interview through an online format or through your phone. Here I want to bring your thoughts on whether you want these conversations to be more personal or less personal. Like when you talk to your interviewees through an online format, or through a mobile device, what kind of account you want to connect to them. Whether you want to use your personal account, like your personal Skype account or personal Zoom account, or you want to use a like a work kind of a style or professional style account to your interviewees, to communicate with your interviewees. And the same when you ask for their Zoom account or their Teams account. Yeah, even when you think about which one, like if you use Microsoft Teams, it is more possible that you would probably you would get a professional account from your interviewee. And if you're using a Zoom, it could be a personal account or like company organizational account. So that would make a difference on how personal the relationship would be between you and your participant. So this is something you could think of. And how to get trust from the company that you want to study, or directly from your research participants, and what to say and what not to say in your interviews. Yeah, I really want to remind you not to use too theoretical terms in your interviews. Some students, like when they are designing their interview questions, they refer to the terms that they have read from literature. But not many of your interviewees would have read the same literature that you have read, or the same books, that you have read. It is very possible that they probably do not understand the terms, the theoretical terms that you use in the interviews. So try to rephrase them into an expression that your interviews would understand. And a good way to test that is to do a pilot study where you can try your questions with someone probably like you can ask maybe your friend or your family member to help and to play the role of a fake interviewee, and test out your interview questions whether they can understand. If they can understand, your interviewees probably should be able to understand as well. And you should also think about where to conduct your interviews, whether you want to conduct your interview in like Starbucks, in a coffee shop, or you want to conduct it in maybe a space, a room in a library, or you can think about how formal or informal you want your interview to be, and what to wear, whether you want to create a more professional image or a more kind of a casual image to your interviewees, depending on the nature of your research project, isn't it? If you want yourself to look more professional, then you would wear something more professional. So it depends on the nature of your research question or your research project. And about recordings, yeah, it could create some anxiety, especially in the past when smartphones are not that popular. So when somebody seeing you holding a recorder and towards them, they may feel more anxious about it. But nowadays, with the population of the smartphones, and many people are used to talk to a phone, so it is less of an issue. But you still need to keep that in mind. Of what if your interviewee and do not feel comfortable about your recording? Do you have a backup plan? And and maybe you could take note when you are conducting your interview, and transcribing, whether you want to transcribe all of your recordings or just part of your recordings. Okay, And this is some, well, this is for some of you who are interested in how to build up rapport. For anyone who doesn't know what rapport means, it refers to a trust relationship. So it basically means how you relationship or how your relation, how's your relation with another person, and or trust with another person. So a rapport in the interview would be your relation with your interviewees. So this is a reading for some of you who are interested on establishing a rapport with your interviewees. Okay, that's it about interviews or research interviews, to be specific. In the next part, I will introduce another popular qualitative method, which is called ethnography. So I will see you in the next part.